Hello everyone, and welcome to a Canadian Highlander Points Philosophy PowerPoint presentation. I have been wanting more content relating to format philosophy. I really enjoy thinking about philosophy and how it relates to Magic the Gathering, card assessment, card frameworks, and so I decided that I would sit down and make something sort of along those lines in the hopes that it inspires others to both think and write and act upon some of these different concepts that I find so interesting and fascinating. As a warning, throughout this video, of course, I will be citing many cards that you may or may not be familiar with, and I will be speaking with the assumption that you already have some rudimentary knowledge of how Canadian Highlander works, the existence of the points list, some of the different cards that are pointed, some of the different, macro archetypes and strategies available in Canadian Highlander, and some recent tournament results and things along those lines. So if at any point you find yourself not sort of keeping tabs on what's going on, don't hesitate to pause the video, go take a look on a Scryfall tab, look up the card, or, ask some questions in the Canadian Highlander Discord to fill out those gaps in information. As a last sort of warning, I'll be pausing periodically to drink water because this is probably going to be long, if I know myself, and I do. So let's dive into it. I want to start by sort of mapping out the discussion that I'm about to have. I wanted to start with some holistic format vision. Oh God, holistic's with an H, isn't it? Okay. Some holistic format vision, sort of talking about three different pillars of Canadian Highlander, at least the pillars that I believe there to be present in Canadian Highlander. I'm going to talk about some of the different deck types, some of the deck diversity available within the format, and some of the different ways that we can evaluate deck types in existence with sort of present lists within the Canadian Highlander ecosystem. I'm going to take some time to introduce you guys to the ideas of fair versus unfair. I think many people are going to be familiar with the different deck types and the fair versus unfair card concepts, but what I want to do in this section of the presentation is sort of solidify those terms in how I'm going to be using them. I know that there's a number of different ways that people, and especially people from other communities, right? When you think of the term unfair, people often think that means kind of like bullshit, which is not necessarily the way that we're going to be using the words fair versus unfair in the context of this discussion. So getting some clarity there is, I think, valuable. I'm going to be speaking about hard versus soft pointed cards, which is a framework that I've developed over the past few days as I was working on this presentation to evaluate cards and the way that we choose which pointed cards go into our deck and how those pointed cards influence the deck itself, the deck strategies, and I don't know, it's a cool framework that I've sort of developed to help process and evaluate cards. I'm going to be diving into some of the maintaining balance, the ways that we maintain balance, and I don't mean the one white card that does a lot of cool things, but how do we evaluate different cards, their macros, their sense in the macro and their sense in the micro? How do we evaluate the format and the meta within the context of these different decks that are influenced by different points? So not only balancing the points list, but also balancing sort of a meta and a player experience perspective as well. I'm then going to essentially talk about every card on the points list. I have grouped them for brevity and for, conciseness' sake, but I will be speaking briefly on each card and sort of why I think they're present and the ways in which we can use some of these other frameworks that we've talked about up here to play into understanding these cards and why they're pointed. I'm then going to move on from talking about what sort of is presently to give you guys some things to think about. I want to speak on some of sort of Wizards' design over the past 10 years and in the past 5 and in the past 2, sort of condensing on what does the future of Magic look like and what are some of the cards that right now we see in our format that are, problems for one reason or another, or, whether or not they're problems, sort of things to consider with regards to the future. And of course, I want to close this out with some thoughts on the medium to long run of Canadian Highlander, what's happening over the next 3, 5, 7 years in this format, and how we may need to adjust some of the frameworks that we use and adjust the points list to sort of manage the format growth as it continues to grow. So I guess with all that said, let's dive in. I think there are three pillars that I myself have identified as being sort of fundamental and core to Canadian Highlander. The first is that Canadian Highlander is an eternal format. This is a place where you can play anything, except for Luris, but you can play anything else. Every single card in the entirety of the history of Magic is legal. And not only is it legal, but you're incentivized to play with those cards, and you will enjoy being able to play with some of the strongest and some of the oldest Magic cards in the history of this game. And I think that this is a really strong pull towards Canadian Highlander in comparison to other eternal, quote-unquote, eternal formats. Legacy has a significant banned list. Vintage has a significant restricted list. And CEDH is not really balanced at all around competitive play, which is fine. But what it means is that you don't really have a place where you can play with all of the oldest cards and have archetype diversity. In Vintage, where you can actually truly play with all of the oldest Magic cards, there is not really a balance in archetypes. It's different flavors of combo or very, very broken four-ofs. But the fundamental sort of experience of being able to play aggro, combo, and control in somewhat traditional terms, right? You could categorize, the workshop decks in Vintage as control decks. But I think in a more traditional sense, we're thinking about blue-based control, which is something that Canadian Highlander does more so than any other format. I don't know of another format where you truly get, the more traditional aggro, combo, and control experiences represented so well in a format quite like Canadian Highlander. I also think that this, of these two sort of core pillars, this third pillar is also a pretty important one, and one that is echoed in a format like Commander, which is we want you to play with everything. We love all of the old cards. We love all these different types of gameplay, and we want you to play with as many of your favorite cards as you possibly can. That doesn't mean that you're going to do well if you just shove all your favorite cards that don't have cohesive strategic sense together, but that you can play with them if you want to. And it incentivizes brewing, it incentivizes creativity, and it creates opportunities for players to truly express themselves in a way that in Canadian Highlander that I don't see necessarily in Legacy and Vintage, the other more competitive eternal formats that exist. So I've broken this down. This is not my framework. Deck types and deck diversity, these ideas, these concepts have been around for many, many, many years. I am far from the first person to use these terms, and I'm sure I will be far from the last. I want to speak a little bit about each of these different types, how I'm going to be using them, and examples of those in Canadian Highlander. So aggro decks, relatively self-explanatory. They are very aggressive. They seek to put creatures in play, turn them sideways, and end your opponent's life as quickly as possible. Control decks also seek to put things into play and turn them sideways, but the main difference is the time span. Control decks are perfectly happy to deal the finishing blow on turn 10 or turn 15, whereas aggro decks are going to be hard-pressed to try to keep going into the 8, 9, 10 turns of the game when there are many, many lands in play and much more slower engines that are starting to take over the game. Combo doesn't really seek to put a bunch of creatures into play unless the number of creatures it's putting into play is something that is very, very, very large. Hundreds of thousands or millions or arbitrary infinite amounts of creatures. Otherwise, they seek to utterly obliterate core deck building principles and win by playing non-traditional Magic or assembling a non-traditional Magic sort of experience. Tempo and mid-range are both sort of two sides of the same coin. I think tempo is probably more aggro control and mid-range is more control aggro, but either way, this is the term that we use generally to describe decks that have both the ability to go quickly, so you might play early threats to try to get underneath a combo deck, but you also have the ability to play a more controlling game if you have to sort of dictate the pace of the match. And the flexibility to swap between these two ideas is sort of what categorizes tempo and mid-range decks most instrumentally. Combo control decks are some of my personal favorite type of decks. I think that these decks are best explained using the concept of the window. Over the course of a game, from turn 1 to the end of the game, every combo deck has a window, and if your window is very small, then the amount of time where you have the ability to present your combo is very small. And if you have a very wide window, then it means it doesn't really matter too much when you present your combo because your window is very open. Combo control decks seek to gain information about the deck that they're playing against, about the knowledge and the matchup, to measure out how many turns you have left, to present your combo when it is most optimal to do so. So most pure combo decks, decks like Storm or Flash, will intend to present a combo as quickly as possible. Combo control decks, on the other hand, are not necessarily intended in speed. It is sometimes true that their window is as quickly as they can assemble it, but oftentimes it is not necessarily as quickly as possible, and it is not necessarily the very last moment, but somewhere in the middle. And combo control decks are categorized by identifying that window and executing on that window when it's available. Triple question mark is sort of a combination of all three. I think that the only real decks that I could think of that sort of fit all three of these categories all at once is a deck like Slushy, which it's basically a tempo Jeskai deck with a Underworld Breach combo package stapled into it. So it plays the tempo game plan with the ability to throw a combo on the stack at some point during the game as well. But otherwise, it's very tough for me to think of a deck that plays all three of these, because while there is some overlap, it is not as common as you would think. Speaking of uncommon, aggro combo, I mean, it is very hard for me to think of a deck that kind of fits into this sort of like idea. The closest thing that I could think of was sort of like a Natural Order Elves combo deck, where you have sort of a fundamental, play elves, turn them sideways, game plan, and sometimes you just pivot to a massive sort of combo, make a bunch of mana, do a Natural Order, do some sort of combo style thing to complement your sort of aggro game plan. Jumping back to sort of describe different decks, I think some aggro decks include like Red Deck Wins, Boros Initiative, and Gruul Monsters. Some control decks include things like Blue Moon, blue-based hard control. Decks like Mono Red Prison are more controlling. Combo decks, of course, Flash and Storm. Tempo decks include things like Jeskai. I also think D&T is actually a tempo or a mid-range deck. The death part of D&T is the aggro, and the taxes part is the control. So there's an argument to be made that while it typically presents play patterns that are very aggro in nature, however how taxes your taxes part of D&T can pull it into the tempo or the mid-range component as well. Although I think most modern decks are basically just aggro decks with light control elements as a part of them. Combo control decks include things like Scapeshift. Most Thassa's Oracle decks are combo control. The way that I play Time Vault is a combo control deck. And then, I've already covered, I think, exactly Slushy to fit into this sort of middle category. And then, Elves was my only example of potentially an aggro combo deck. So let's talk about fair versus unfair. Fair decks seek to leverage exceptional card quality, and they try to beat you with synergy, cohesive deck design, and raw card efficiency. Unfair decks seek to suspend some of those principles to find, produce, and protect something that subverts the quote-unquote normal gameplay experience. Fair decks are most decks that are both aggro and control. Aggro and control decks are almost always fair. Unfair decks are almost always combo. It is hard to try to play a aggro deck that is, giving up on synergy, cohesive deck design, and raw card efficiency to just throw a combo into the middle of it. The way that your deck works is by having synergy and cohesive deck design, not by, assembling a weird A plus B or A plus B plus C, combo in the middle of your mono red attacking strategy. That doesn't mean that there aren't necessarily incidental unfair aspects to these decks, but generally speaking, your aggro decks, your tempo decks, and your control decks are all going to be playing mostly fair cards, and your combo decks are going to be playing mostly unfair cards. Of course, not all cards are the same in all decks. Ancestral Recall is a fair card. It is a synergistic, cohesive, and raw card efficiency. It certainly feels unfair when your opponent resolves Ancestral Recall, but it's not an unfair card. It's just a highly efficient, well, unreasonably efficient card for what it does. Ponder is not an unfair card. Ancestral Recall is just Ponder juiced up to 10. Well, to 7, but the point being that Ancestral Recall is a fair card, even if it's an egregiously powerful one. On the flip side, Flash is never a fair card. Nobody is like, oh, I'm going to play a fair Flash and put in a 5-drop and pay 5 mana for it just at instant speed. Flash is an unfair card, and the only real reason to play Flash is because you put it in the middle of an unfair deck seeking to assemble the Flash A+B. A fair Flash just doesn't really exist. Black Lotus is, both. When Black Lotus lives in Storm decks, right, Breach, Lotus, Storm, as your 10-point spread, that is an unfair existence of Black Lotus. You are subverting the fundamental philosophy and strategy of a quote-unquote fair, normal Magic the Gathering game experience by creating this A+B+C of Black Lotus, Underworld Breach, and, a Brain Freeze or a Jace Perfected Mind or whatever it may be. But you can also play Black Lotus in aggro decks. And while it doesn't, again, feel particularly fair to have somebody drop, a Questing Beast on turn 1 and Gruul monsters off of a Black Lotus, it is certainly still a fair strategy. You're trying to beat you with synergy, cohesive deck design, and raw card efficiency. Black Lotus just so happens to be the most egregious form of fast mana that exists. So, of course, this brings us to the point that this is a spectrum. It is not a binary. Cards can exist in both fair and unfair categories, in both fair and unfair decks, without having to be fair or unfair unto themselves. Of course, some cards lean much more strongly one way or the other. And I think Flash is a perfect example of a card that basically is, there's no fair Flash. Nobody on this earth is fair flashing. It's always an unfair Flash. And I think this is a good way to sort of evaluate or think about cards using this framework. Soft-pointed cards are cards that are added to your existing deck, strategy, or vision to provide support and strength to the resilience, consistency, and speed of the deck. Hard-pointed cards are cards that are the deck unto themselves. Oftentimes, hard-pointed cards become the name and the identity of the deck itself. Basically, all points that go into combo decks are hard points. You are determining at some point during the evaluation of the deck that what you are doing with your points is the deck. Flash, that's a hard point. You cannot cut Flash for a different card that sort of does similar stuff or feeds different areas. The deck is Flash. The same with Thassa's Oracle or, Underworld Breach. For the most part, these are cards that are hard pointed. They are the deck. That's what you do when you play the deck, is play these cards unto themselves. Ancestral Recall is a soft-pointed card. You can take a mid-range tempo Jeskai deck and remove Ancestral Recall and play other cards, and the deck strategy and vision is still coherent and cohesive. You're still playing a mid-range tempo deck. But if you take Flash out of the Flash deck, it's no longer a deck. It's no longer what it was designed to be. It doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. It's a different deck. So this idea of soft versus hard-pointed cards is another interesting and powerful framework that I've been using to evaluate different cards. One of the other ways to think about hard points within combo decks is that when you point cards that are in combo decks, you are directly curbing that deck's, quote, goldfishing speed. So combo decks, especially the most aggressive ones, the most fast ones, the ones with the least amount of plan that are not winning the game, such as Flash, the average speed of the Flash deck is directly correlated to how many points that deck gets, because all of the rest of its points are going to be used playing additional tutors to find the Flash. So the hard-pointed combo decks are some of the ones that are most vulnerable to targeted pointings and are also some of the ones that are most easily evaluated in the context of card pointings. It's very easy to say, well, we can't put Demonic Tutor to 0 because now Flash decks get Demonic Tutor at 0 points. That's crazy good. We can't do that. It's much harder to evaluate soft-pointed cards and the nuances of them because the strategies, the deck, and the vision itself are existing unto themselves, even without necessarily the points that are in the decks themselves. So I think that's another framework that I've developed that is useful and interesting to think about when looking at these cards. Sorry, one more thing to talk about here. Soft-pointed cards fit into many different decks. So when you adjust the points on soft-pointed cards, you have ripple effects throughout the meta into many, many different corners of the format. And soft-pointed cards can be the most dangerous to manipulate because they can change the buy-in to the format, right? If you change Moxen from 3 to 4, for example, and players have been playing with 3x Moxen decks for a while, you're now sort of fundamentally changing the deck experience that they're going to get to have. So you have much more ripples and much more small things that you have to deal with when you make changes to soft-pointed cards versus when you make changes to hard-pointed cards. I like to provide sort of these sort of three frameworks that I've talked about, right? Deck types, fair versus unfair, and hard versus soft-pointed cards, as ways to improve the discussion surrounding pointed cards. Some of this is going to be self-explanatory, but when discussing a format's overall health and the ways that different types of decks create different metas and play patterns, having these extra tools in our metaphorical toolbox sort of improves the way that we can discuss and think about the format. Because as it turns out, maintaining a format is very, very hard. It's important to note that I think maintaining a points list is not the only thing important to maintaining balance. So cards in isolation may not necessarily be point worthy, but when enough cards that are sort of a half point are collected, it results in decks playing what feels like 3 or 4 free points when you speak to this sort of collection of these half-pointed cards. So this is where it starts to be important to evaluate not only the cards themselves as being individually pointed, but also of the way that that sort of shapes the meta. If the meta is play all the half-point cards, that's a subtly problematic thing. Overtly problematic things are like everybody's playing Flash, right? It's the best deck, everybody's playing it. That's an overt problem. But a subtle problem is that 90% of the decks that are top tier all play these 15 half-point cards collectively all at the same time. And so when we think about cards that are meta or cards that sort of exist in this subtle sort of point balancing thing, we want to be looking at the meta more broadly in those contexts. And also there's this fundamental question of like what cards are just meta, right? It's okay for cards to be pervasive and in many different decks all across the board, versus what cards should we think about as being like pointed meta, right? These are the cards that we need to add to the points list to help shape the meta versus things that are just okay for there to be a part of the meta. And my hope is that with some of these different frameworks, we might be able to help think about these things, these more subtle meta shifts and point shifts in a way that we wouldn't necessarily be able to without some of these frameworks. The success of the format is not just the balance of the points list and of the meta, but also, the fundamental enjoyment of it. It's not enough that the format is designed around our aforementioned pillars, but also that the pillars and the meta and the points list create positive and resonant experience for players. Funnily enough, I'm going to talk in a little bit about why I don't think we should be evaluating pointed cards on the basis of resonant experience, but that we do need to evaluate the meta on the basis of resonant experience. Thinking about cards on the points list in both the micro context, right, the context in which they exist within decks, as well as in the macro context in which they exist in the meta. Both of these are important things, but I want to evaluate them both in context separately before we evaluate them sort of holistically. And the reason for that we'll sort of get to. Maybe another way to think about it also is that player experience is pretty irrelevant when evaluating the balance of the format, but pretty important when evaluating the health of one. Like, if you don't enjoy playing against a certain type of deck, that's relevant in the context of the health of the format and sort of the enjoyment of it. But if the deck itself is not inherently broken, that doesn't mean that the format is imbalanced, right? And so thinking about the balance and the enjoyment as sort of separate components that are both important, but not necessarily a part of the same conversation, I think is a relevant way to think about stuff. The enjoyment of the format is fundamentally an adherence to a core vision with buy-in. And this term buy-in does not refer to price. It does not refer to the cost of cards, but it refers to the sort of personal identification and sort of affiliation with the format's core principles and guidances. So in a format like Legacy, where Force of Will and Brainstorm and, even like Delver to some extent are sort of these core components of the deck, right? Like that's a format with Days and Wasteland and Brainstorm, and that's Legacy. That's what it means to be playing Legacy. People enjoy playing Legacy because that's the core vision, and they agree with it. The format is adhering to that core vision, and players buy into it. If players didn't buy into the Legacy vision of Brainstorm and Force of Will, they wouldn't have fun. The enjoyment would not exist. And if Legacy fundamentally changed what its core vision was, overnight they decide they're going to ban Force of Will and Brainstorm, then it doesn't matter if players bought into Legacy, and again, not financially, but it doesn't matter if they bought into the idea of Legacy, because the idea of Legacy is gone. So what we need to be able to do is not only maintain the balance of the format and to maintain the enjoyment of the format, but also that the identity of the format that players are buying into is maintained. It is adhered to, so that players don't feel that they're just getting, jerked around. And this is kind of where I'm talking about stability and player trust are more important than balance in and of itself, right? A format can be balanced and a format can be, enjoyed, but if it's not stable and players don't have trust that the format that they are choosing to spend their time on, that they're choosing to invest their time on over and over, day after day, month after month, is not stable, they're going to get tired of it. And that's especially true for formats that are more homegrown, right? With WotC, you have a level of support and establishmentness that you can sort of get away with, right? The format's going to be stable because WotC says it's going to be stable and it'll still be there in 5 years. That's not necessarily true of homegrown formats, and so a lot of the success of like EDH came off of the back of stability and player trust. That the format is slow, it is gentle. It is not going to fundamentally mess up what you have enjoyed doing for the past, 10 or 5 years in the format. And, as long as the format is balanced and it's enjoyed, you're off to the good start, but you also need to have stability and player trust. This isn't to say that you can't have a successful format that is homegrown with very aggressive committees, right? 7-Point Highlander, Australian Highlander, they prune cards very aggressively in and out of their format. The format is not stable in the same sense that it is in Canadian Highlander, where we point things very, very non-liberally, right? Very conservative in adding cards to the points list. But the player trust in the committee is different. The buy-in for that format, the core vision and buy-in for that format is fundamentally different. And so because they are continuing to adhere to that, it doesn't matter that the stability is different, because what players bought into was a stability that is, again, different than the one that they're buying into when they jump into Canadian Highlander. Yeah, I think that's what I have to say on this. So let's talk about the points list. I've talked about some of the different ways that I use to evaluate cards, and I want to chime in on some of them, some of these ideas that I didn't think necessarily had or desired or needed a whole slide unto themselves. To start, we're not evaluating cards based on how fun they are. And again, this is what I'm talking about when I say micro versus macro. If I personally don't enjoy playing against Flash, but Flash is not a meta problem, we're not going to point Flash to higher. It doesn't matter if you do or don't enjoy playing against Flash. That's not our problem. We don't care unless Flash is causing meta problems, right? If people don't enjoy playing against Flash because they need to add a bunch of anti-Flash cards to their deck in order for their decks to be viable, that's a problem, right? That's not fun deck building, right? But the fact that because Flash exists and its play patterns are not interesting, that doesn't at all change whether or not we're going to increase or decrease the amount of points that Flash is, unless of course it corresponds to an increase in meta share that is a problem unto itself. We are not going to point cards based on their accessibility. This is something that I guess not we, I'm not a part of the council, but like philosophically, we should not be evaluating cards based on their accessibility. It doesn't matter whether or not Flash is a 50-cent card or Ancestral Recall is a $4,000 card. The ability for cards to be purchased and played in tournaments should not in any way change the way that we point cards. The job, our job is to create a format that is balanced, that is fun, that is enjoyable, that is resonant. It is not to create a format that is affordable. I think that one of the flaws of Australian Highlander is their policy that if you play no reserved list cards, you get an extra point. That does not improve accessibility, right? It does in the sort of, you know, micro sense, in that you can just not play dual lands and get an extra point, and, you know, not play some of the other pointed or the other restricted cards and get an extra point. So it increases accessibility in the real world, and the problem with that is that it doesn't increase accessibility empirically. This is I'm going to get to more of this later, but like a good format will be able to acquire players regardless of the cost of the deck. And our job is to create a good format, not to create an affordable format. CEDH decks, as an example, are like $2,500 to $5,000 minimum. And it is growing faster than any other competitive format in the scene. Like CEDH is growing at unbelievable rates. And the reason is because the community of CEDH has agreed that they want to play with proxies more than they want to play with reserved list cards. Or, well, that's not true. They want to play with proxies more than they want to play with real cards, not reserved list cards. And because the community was so insistent on it, that's what happened. Every single event, almost every single CDH event that is major plays and allows like either full proxies or very close to it. That is how we deal with and address accessibility, not by changing the way that our point structure works. I know that early on, one of the things that I believe they did is they said that if you are, you know, you're allowed to play with gold border cards and that they are like officially legal as per the format inception. That doesn't fix the accessibility issue. This is, if we want the greatest number of people, we need to make proxies the fundamental standard. There's no other way solves the problem. This is an eternal format. Black Lotus is not going to get any cheaper. We should use comparative pointings, but only as a tool, not any more than that. And this is sort of just a shorthand way to say something that, like, Talion Academy at 1 point and Vampiric Tutor at 2 points does not mean that Vampiric Tutor is twice as strong as Talion Academy. It also isn't to say that, like, you know, Vampiric Tutor and Umezawa Jite are of the same strength, or you know that Treasure Cruise and Mystical Tutor and Talion Academy are all the same strength. You know, or that Black Lotus is 7 times stronger than Academy or whatever, right? It's useful to think about cards in terms of, well, if this card is 2 points and this type of card is worth generally 2 points, that this new future card that we might, you know, be evaluating is probably worth 2 points, but not more than that. You don't want to get into the habit of thinking that like all 1 point cards are the same strength, because that's not true. I mean, just start, that's not true. And second, because you don't want to evaluate cards in a vacuum, right? No card exists on the point lists by itself. It exists there because of the way that it interacts with other cards that are on and off the points list, and we don't want to use comparative pointing as sort of a way to evaluate cards too aggressively. We should evaluate how cards can be used in different ways in different decks. So we need to think about how cards fit into each of the different archetypes, whether they're being used as both unfair or fair cards in those contexts. We also want to talk about how they get pulled in different directions, right? If you're going to add a Soul Ring to your deck, it can be pulled as an artifact combo deck, or it could be pulled as just a deck trying to resolve 4-drops on turn 2. We should evaluate how widespread a card is between archetypes. You know, if we see Soul Ring is in every single card, regardless of whether it's a control deck, a combo deck, or a aggro deck, that probably means that the card is worth more points just because it's being used everywhere. There's a lot of cards that get pointed because of what they do within specific archetypes. Like, you know, True Name Nemesis is too strong of a card for control decks to have for free. You know, Soul Ring or Mana Crypt is too strong of a card for, you know, aggro decks to have for free. But the fact that a card gets spread into a bunch of different archetypes is indicative of something that maybe should be pointed for reasons that are not distinctly apparent in those specific archetypes. And sort of course, this leads us to, how points impact matchups and in the meta. So I think I speak on this a little bit more later, but like a card like Umezawa Jite is a card that's very good into certain types of matchups. And so we want to think about how those cards, maybe we have to point cards because they push other archetypes down, right? If there was a card that was 1 mana that, blanked every single tutor, it makes combo decks way weaker, much harder to play into a world where that hypothetical card exists. And we might be talking about pointing it even though it's not a particularly strong card. It's like it does nothing into aggro, but because it impacts combo so aggressively and one of our pillars is archetype viability, we have to think about it in the context of the matchups that the card is played in and the meta that the card is within. So let's evaluate the points list. I've broken the 37 cards on the points list into sort of 5 distinct categories. 12 of the cards are above rate mana. So above rate in this context is referring to there's some like fair or normal or reasonable rate to get mana in our format. Typically, the gold standard for like say artifact mana is 2 for 1. So you're allowed to spend 2 mana on an artifact to get 1 mana in return. Anything that is at a rate better than that is above rate. Same with tutors, right? You could take like a diabolic tutor, which is 4 mana to find a card. That's pretty much on rate. 4 mana find anything is so fair that it gets reprinted into standard. That's on rate. So tutors that are better than that are above rate. Above rate combos and everything else. You sort of get the picture. So let's dive in. Here's our mana list. These are all the cards that are above rate on making mana. Black Lotus is both a fair and an unfair card. It is both soft pointed and hard pointed, depending on if it's in a combo deck versus if it's in an aggro deck. Mana Crypt, Soul Ring, and the Moxen, generally speaking, live in the aggro space. There's there's some combo decks, especially artifact combo decks, that will throw in a single Pearl or a Sapphire or something like that to close out their mana spread. But all the decks that are playing, triple Moxen or Mox Ring or, Crypt Ring, Mana Vault or something like that, these are decks that live in the aggro space or the tempo space where they're trying to create some threats and create those threats a little bit earlier than you might be ready to deal with. These are soft point cards. If you were to increase Crypt to 6, the aggro deck doesn't change what it's doing. It just shifts its points around to whatever the most important spread is for the aggro deck. But the strategy of the aggro deck doesn't really change. Tinker and Natural Order, on the other hand, are generally hard-pointed cards. If you're playing a Tinker deck, you're playing a deck that does the Tinker thing. You put cards into your deck specifically because of Tinker, and if you take Tinker out of the deck, it shapes and fundamentally changes the way the deck is intended to be played and does get played. I think Natural Order is the same thing because, again, you're not going to put an Atraxa or, a Woodfall Primus or a Craterhoof necessarily into your deck if you're not also able to cheat it out for only 4 mana. I think Natural Order, again, not a spectrum. Hard and soft can be different ends of a spectrum. Natural Order sometimes falls somewhat into the middle where it can be both hard and soft depending on the deck that it's within. Tolarian Academy is absolutely a hard-pointed card. You either play Academy with all the Academy stuff, or you don't play Academy. I think that it's very rare, very, very, very rare for you to take a deck and then just throw an Academy in or out of it depending on the day. It either is a deck that plans to pay off Tolarian Academy, or it's a deck that doesn't plan to pay off Tolarian Academy. Mana Vault, I think, is a great one-point card in that it fits, into some specific decks that want density effect, and it doesn't really want to be played in decks that aren't intending to abuse it. Cards like Mana Vault are things that, if every deck could play it, they probably would, but it doesn't justify itself as being more than 1 point because it's not so egregiously powerful. I also think Mana Vault is pretty close to a soft card. It's not very hard. You can very easily give and take it in any deck that wants it. But the decks that want it are willing to pay a point for it, and the decks that don't. So I really like Mana Vault as its sort of its place on the points list. Tutors. Oh, Lord. Okay, tutors. So, Demonic Tutor, starting at the top, working our way down. Demonic Tutor is both fair and unfair. It is, or not, sorry, it is both soft and hard pointed, depending on the deck. Demonic Tutor in a Reanimator deck is a soft point because you don't really need Demonic Tutor specifically. You could choose a different spread of tutors because really your goal is just to be able to find things. Versus Demonic Tutor in an Underworld Breach deck, it's closer to a hard point. If you're going to play Demonic Tutor in Breach, then one of the reasons you're doing so is because Demonic Tutor finds Breach, which recasts Demonic Tutor, which finds your Lion's Eye Diamond, which recasts Demonic Tutor to go find your Brain Freeze, which wins you the game. And so Demonic Tutor is sort of this 1 point, hard combo piece that you're using in the specific Demonic Tutor Underworld Breach style decks. So another one that sort of fits into both. An interesting thing about tutors is tutors primarily get pointed because of combo decks, because combo resiliency is a problem. But there are examples where that's not true. I want to say Birthing Pod is an example where that's not true, but maybe it's not. Maybe they all are. Maybe they all are just for combos. Honestly, maybe Survival. I don't know. I don't know how Survival works, to be honest, but we'll get to that. So Gifts is an unfair card that is soft pointed. So it's kind of neat to think about things that are, fair versus unfair. Gifts is one of the cards that fits really well into archetypes like Breach and into archetypes like Thoracle, which are unfair. But it's also not mandatory for those decks. So something like Spellseeker is an unfair, hard-pointed card. If you're playing Spellseeker, you're playing it in Seeker Walk. Whereas if you're playing Gifts, it's an unfair, soft-pointed card, in that you can cut it in your unfair decks to make room for different types of tutors that fit more, cohesively with the game plan. And of course, the same is for Intuition as well. For Vamp Tutor, Imperial Seal, Mystical Tutor, Wishclaw, they're mostly generic tutors. Mystical does see play in both control decks to find things like Recall. So I guess more tempo decks to find things like Recall and the White Miracle one. And then combo decks, of course, to find your flashes. But these are mostly generic tutors, and I don't have much to add to think about them. Tainted Pact is a really cool card, in my opinion, in that it gets to be, like, quite literally hard as hard can be pointed in Thoracle, but it's soft pointed everywhere else. So in a Thoracle deck, you have to play Tainted Pact. It's basically incorrect to play Thoracle without Tainted Pact. But Tainted Pact in basically every other deck is a soft pointed card. You don't play it because you have to. You play it because you want to, which is sort of an interesting place for it to exist. Merchant Scroll is one of the cards that I do want to dive in sort of deep into and think about in a little bit more. I think it's a very elegantly pointed card, because if we bumped up Flash and Ancestral Recall to 8 points, we could you could say Merchant Scroll is free, right? We're basically forcing them to play Merchant Scroll in exchange for a 1-point card. But we can't have Merchant Scroll be free at 7. We don't want them to just get this card for free. So it is, notably worse than many of these other 1-point cards, both in the tutor Merchant Scroll versus, Mystical Tutor. Are you kidding me? Like, crazy. Completely different, scales in terms of points. But we can't have it be 0 points because of what it does in the context of combo. So using comparative pointing here would be really bad, right? We don't want to say, well, Mystical Tutor or Merchant Scroll shouldn't be on the point because Imperial Seal is only 1 point, and Mystical Tutor is only 1 point, and Tainted Pact is only 1 point, and Wishclaw is only 1 point. Merchant Scroll is so much worse than all these other cards. However, we can't let combo decks have that many free points. So it's a great card that nobody plays at 1 point, but it has to be 1 point because of what it would imply on the rest of the decks, on the meta consideration, and combo decks as a whole if we let it just sort of be free, So I really like this card on the points list where it is. I think Birthing Pod lives in a somewhat similar space as Merchant Scroll. My understanding with Birthing Pod is that it's pointed to sort of keep Seeker Walk in check, but generally that it's somewhat unplayable otherwise. So the question sort of becomes, is Birthing Pod is Seeker Walk such a scary combo deck that we need to keep Birthing Pod on the list in order to avoid it becoming too strong? And it's a question I don't know the answer to, because I've barely played against Seeker Walk, but I know at a point in time it was quite the bogeyman. So I understand why it exists in there from that point in time. And unfortunately, Survival, I just don't play against decks that play Survival, and I haven't really seen any decks that play it, so I don't really know anything about it. It's placed on the list, but I think that's covering most of the points list in their tutors. Yeah, tutors, again, mostly big picture. They're combo cards, combo decks require consistency. Tutors are consistency. There's not a lot to talk about these in the context of control or aggro, although, some control and some aggro decks will play bits and pieces here and there. So somewhat obviously, you Flash, Thassa's Oracle, Time Vault, Time Walk, Underworld Breach. These cards are all hard-pointed. You put them in your deck because you intend to abuse them. You don't put them in your deck if you're not intending to abuse them. You can't really cut any one of these cards from your deck and have your deck still be cohesive and coherent in the way that it was, because they are primarily combo cards. There's an argument to be made that you can cut a Yogg-Will from a Storm deck and that it is still able to be a Storm deck using other cards, but the other cards are things like Underworld Breach. So there's mostly they're mostly hard-pointed. I think that you could make the argument again that some Time Walk decks are not hard-pointed Time Walk decks. Like if you're playing Time Walk in quote-unquote fair Time Walk, right? Not in a Seeker Walk unfair combo context. If you're just doing it as like take an extra turn to get another attack step off with aggro decks, or to draw an extra card and make a land drop for control decks, you are playing a fair Time Walk. But I don't know anybody who does that, so I don't think it's very common. Otherwise, these are hard-pointed cards. And this is the rest of the points list. It's interesting to me that you can go through and sort of break them down into, mana, tutors, and combos, and then this is what's left. There's only 7 cards that don't fall into one of those categories. The rest of the combo list, or the rest of these cards, are just sort of really strong cards. They're the best in class at doing what they do, and I'm not going to talk about, let's ignore GT for a second. Otherwise, they're best in class at doing what they do. True Name Nemesis, phenomenal card into tempo, phenomenal card for control. It provides reach into every matchup. It provides a pretty much undisruptible clock. Dig Through Time, Treasure Cruise, some of the best draw engines ever printed, outside of the best draw engine, not engine, but the best draw card ever printed. Mana Drain is the best counter spell ever printed. It's, okay, well, maybe it's Force of Will, but at minimum, Mana Drain is the second best counter spell ever printed, and it fits really, solidly into the, tempo and mid-range and control decks that use it to deploy very, very large threats partially through. I think every card on this list is soft-pointed except for maybe Strip Mine. If you're playing a lands deck, you want Strip Mine. Some aggro decks are going to play a Strip Mine as a part of their point spread instead of a Moxen, and things like that are not unreasonable to do so. So you could say that Strip Mine has got a little bit of softness to it, and Strip Mine, of course, is a card that both in those contexts is fair, but otherwise is very unfair. It's just trying to be a combo card to strip lock your opponents out of lands. I don't know how, lands is on the back burner. Lands is in a rough spot. Strip Mine maybe at 3 is a little aggressive, but it's still a very, very strong card. So can't argue with it being sort of best in class at doing what it does. Consider the following. Most of the cards that we look at on the pointed list are the old ones. Broken Mana and Tutors don't come out very often. In the past 21 years, we've only seen a new Broken Mana or Broken Tutor. We've seen 4 of them in 21 years. All the rest are from the first 9 years of Magic's design. We don't see new combos very often, right? The only 2 brand new combo cards we got are Thassa's Oracle and Underworld Breach, both of which are problems because they synergize with old broken cards. And, even of our above right tutors, Spellseeker, Witchclaw, Birthing Pod, they're not problems because they themselves are problematic, but because they find problematic cards. So really what we leave here, the majority of these cards are going to be old or synergize with old cards. The difference is this everything else category. I think this is one place where we might have a philosophical hole in our pointing strategy or our pointing philosophy, because while we can easily break down the above rate mana and above rate tutor and both point to the early design mistakes and understand how they synergize with present design mistakes, it's much harder to evaluate the everything else type of card than the ones that fit into one of these 3 neat categories. These are easy. We all understand why these can be problematic or how they're problematic, but this is a lot harder. So consider the following. I've made this list of cards from a bunch of different sources, but they're organized alphabetically, so don't get caught up on the way that they're presented here. None of these cards are broken tutors or broken mana or broken combos. They are all tempo style threats akin to True Name Nemesis. Jeskai, the premier, the number one tempo deck, plays 4 of these 9 cards, and Spearmint, the most common 4-color splash version of it, plays 7 of them. And even more notably, the only green cards in many of the Spearmint lists are cards that are on this list of 7 cards and Omnath, which possibly belongs on this list. These are not hard-pointed cards, right? We would never look at any of these and go, your whole deck exists because of them. They're soft-pointed cards. They're cards that you put in and out of your deck on the basis of your deck strategy or how you're planning to attack your opponent and the strategies you're intending to employ. And they're not unfair cards. They are fair. They live in the fair domain and the fair space. They fit into tempo. They don't fit into combo. Well, maybe Urza's Saga and the One Ring fit into combo, but mostly they fit into tempo. And I think it's somewhat arguable that none of them are really a point unto themselves. None of them are so egregious that they have to be a point, because they haven't been a point for so long. And a number of people, and there's a number of conversations being had about whether or not some of these should be a point, but that's not really the problem with all of them in aggregate. The problem is that all of our typical indicators and frameworks for balancing a points list don't evaluate this stack of half-point cards. They're so strong unto themselves that decks are willing to make compromises from already highly efficient and well-tuned 2- and 3-color strategies just to make space for these extraordinarily powerful tempo threats. When you look at this list of everything else, right, every single card on this list would go under the everything else category. And the only card that these really resemble in my mind is True Name Nemesis. Like this is the most similar card to all of these. And True Name Nemesis is very good. I feel like some of these might be better. To be clear, I'm not advocating for the pointing of all of these cards. And some of these are measurably more problematic than others, right? These 3 are very, very good. This one, a little bit less so. The point that I'm trying to make here is that these are emblematic of an overarching shift in the way that Magic cards are designed. We are not going to get more Soul Rings. We're just not. They know not to print another Soul Ring. But we will get more of these. And when we do, decks that are able to play all of them end up with increasingly higher and higher card quality in the face of decks that choose not to do so or can't do so. I asked myself a few months ago, I said, what can we do to nerf Jeskai? And the answer to me at that point in time was not really apparent. And I'm not saying that we need to nerf Jeskai, but my thought was, wow, Jeskai is really good. Why would I want to play anything that's not just a pile of all the best cards? And the problem isn't really, like, we could up point recall, right? We could say recall to 8, but that's not really the problem with Jeskai. The strength of the deck is that it rolls, half the deck is these quarter point or half point cards that are just so powerful unto themselves that it makes the deck's cohesive strategy sit at the top tier. If we wanted to nerf Jeskai, if we wanted to nerf the 4-color pile problem, and that again, I think is going to be exacerbated as the format grows and as we get larger and larger, we're going to get more and more problems with cards that are like this in this style. Maybe we want to point a few of them now, and maybe we want to be watching out for pointing them in the future, because I'm worried that as the format grows and as WotC prints more design mistakes of this style, that because they don't fit, because they're not one of these, because they're not the obvious frameworks, because they're in the harder to evaluate frameworks, they run under they fly under the radar until it's the point where they feel like they're a part of the format, and we never take the chance to point them when we should. So that's sort of my thought and sort of the piece that I want to speak on and for people to consider. If I had to choose, I think Minskimbu is a great card to point. I've been saying that for a little while. Maybe this card could go. I think it's pretty good. Fourth Yorlingus, also absolutely ridiculous card that fits so phenomenally well into control and aggro and tempo. And I'm, it's starting to see play in all sorts of academy combo decks. Like, this card fits into everything. It's just good everywhere. That's a problem. We don't need cards that are good everywhere. So there's stuff like that. If I had to point to 2, Minskimbu and Fourth are probably the 2 at the top of my list. But, I see arguments for all of these cards. They're all very strong and very generically powerful. So let's talk about format growth. We're getting here close to the end. Here are some questions that I think that we should be keeping in mind about the various states of the format. What does Canadian Highlander look like in 3 years? What do we want it to be in 3 years? What are the types of decks that we still want to see play? What are the players that are going to be playing in this format? And, you know, what does the ideal experience look like? What are we pitching when somebody signs up to play Canadian Highlander? I think it's important to understand in the next 3 years sort of what the breakpoint is going to be for these types of cards. Are we going to get to a place where we need to, is 4-color pile going to be the strongest deck in the format for all of time? Is that a format pitch to new players that they're going to be interested in? How do I go to someone and say, hey, you should play this format? They're like, okay, cool. Can I play goblins? I'm like, yeah, but it's worse than 4-color pile. Like, that's not a good pitch to new players. That's not going to bring players into the format and keep them sticking around. It's not an experience that I think is the type of resonant experience we're looking for to deliver with Canadian Highlander. You know, if you come into the format because you want to play 4-color mirrors, great. Then it works out great. But if you want to explore the depth of the specific tools available to specific colors, or to be able to focus on monocolor and dual color strategies, these are things that we need to be thinking of in a big picture sense and being conscientious of in the long run. Something else, sort of shifting gears a little bit, how are new players going to be onboarded into the format? The Canlander database, the Canlander Winners Archive, the Discord, these are all great ways to onboard players into the format. But when we look in comparison to a format like CEDH, which has, to be fair, infinitely more players, but also infinitely more resources, thinking about ways to create, new onboarding resources is something that we sort of need to be thinking about in the next 3 to 5 years. And I do think that, like, one of the pitches is that players get to play stuff that they don't get to play anywhere else. Like, oh, cool, I get to do X. That's something that we get that other formats don't. We just have to be careful that what X is things that are unique and engaging and interesting, and not just 4-color money pile, because you can go do 4-color money pile anywhere. Why do you want a 4-color money pile here? And why do you want to beat 4-color money pile in this format? I did touch on it briefly. I spoke about proxies in this video already, but I think tournaments and proxies are some of the most important things for format growth. CDH was a niche format for basically 10 years until tournaments started happening regularly at scale and with proxies. This format is unaffordable, and we as a community need to advocate viciously and vicariously for pro proxy tournaments. We also need to show up when events are ran. If we want more Canadian Highlander, we need to show people and show tournament organizers that we are going to be there and that we want to be able to play with proxies, because this format has a ceiling that will exist forever when proxies are not viable in this format. And I say this as somebody who owns a proxy-free Time Vault deck. Like, I don't play with proxies myself because I've spent a ton of money in this stupid game. But that doesn't at all change the fact that in order for this format to grow, in order for me to be able to continue to play my Time Vault deck for the next 10 years, we need to change the way that we view proxies and the way that tournament organizers view proxies in association with Canadian Highlander. It has to happen. And so we get to the end. This slideshow was a labor of love. I think I spent probably 6 or 8 hours preparing for this video, taking notes. I don't personally think I've ever played a format that's created such resonant experiences for me in such a short period of time. I've played CDH for, coming up on, 10 or something years now. Well, not CDH. I've played EDH since 13 years, and, CDH for 3, and Canlander for 6 months. And while I enjoyed playing CDH as much as I did, its deck building at the highest end is very narrow. And the curated ban list that, the fact that there isn't one for CDH really prevents that from changing. Whereas with Canadian Highlander, I truly get to the feeling of playing whatever I want, every card I want, but I don't have to worry about balance never being implemented like it is with CDH. Like, CDH is never going to change. It is basically a fixed format, whereas Canadian Highlander is not. It's a format that can be shaped and molded and changed and grow with every card. And singleton formats get to absorb broken cards way better than 4-of formats. The difference between the reason the One Ring isn't in every single Canadian Highlander deck is because you can't play 4 of them and you can't get rid of it. It belongs in every deck if you could do that, but you can't, and it does a bunch of damage, and it's not necessarily what decks are trying to do. The fact that we can take a card like the One Ring, which has become a multi-format all-star, and absorb it into the format without a huge bunch of damage, I think is a huge boon to Canadian Highlander. And it's one of the things that, keeps me engaged and interested in this format. I'd like to play Modern. I enjoyed playing Modern, and I couldn't continue to play Modern because when Modern Horizons 1 hit, the resonant experience that I had grown to know of playing, against Tron or against Jund, like these decks and these staples had been, eradicated by this wave of new cards. And all the decks were now these new cards, and that was the deck. Well, Canlander doesn't have that problem. So I think that one of the things that, this is one of the things that really draws me into this format and sort of keeps me around and makes me excited, because I can build and brew with anything I want. And almost all of it is viable to some extent, which I think is really, really cool. I think I mentioned this earlier, but I think there's a massive dearth in the amount of written and video philosophy in Canadian Highlander. We just don't have the same resources talking about this format, talking about the points list. I think my creation here is not just for my own benefit to express sort of my love for this format and for the experience of playing this format, but also to sort of inspire others to take up the mantle, to make some of their own content, to create and engage in these dialogues, to use these frameworks to evaluate cards. And, I hope that this video provided some interesting insight. I hope that it added some thoughtful reflection. I speak somewhat off the cuff. I have I had scripts for different sections. There's some parts that got a little bit rambly, but generally this is just sort of me being able to take a space to talk about the things that I enjoy, and hope that some of that is interesting and useful for you as well. As always, you can find me on Discord or Reddit, or I guess, now in the YouTube comments. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Please don't hesitate to begin dialogue with me. My favorite part of Magic Philosophy is not me sitting in front of a computer screen for, oh my God, over an hour, just talking at you about things, but the exchange of information. It's not a one-sided conversation. And the ways that I am able to grow and learn and both identify and speak on these frameworks comes from the fact that people have taken the time in the past to talk to me about their perspectives. And I hope that this kicks off a bunch of dialogue about things in an interesting and neat way. And yeah, that's everything I have to say. Thanks for watching.